Hi, it's Dr. JP. We're in week 6 of English 2020 on disability literature, and we are going to this week talk about monsters and prodigies. I mentioned in the syllabus that we're taking this title, Monsters and Prodigies, from the French surgeon and anatomist Ambroise Paré. He published a work called De Monstres et Prodigies in 1575, and this was translated into English in 1634 as Monsters and Prodigies. It's also known as Monsters and Marvels, and we'll talk about that. But I just want to remind you that that's where our term is coming from. And I've taken my term from Paré because he's an influential figure as far as early modern disability is concerned. And so the real title of this lecture, as opposed to the title of the week, is Early Modern Disability, the Body, Morals, and Monstrosity. So I first want to begin with asking you what you know about the body. And I'd just like you to pause the video and think about it for a minute. Think about what you know and where that knowledge came from and how you would define the body. When we define something, we draw boundaries around a thing or an experience, right? How would you draw boundaries around the body? You might use anatomy to do this. If you've taken anatomy and physiology, that might be something that you do. And we'll talk about this more in class when we meet via Zoom, but I want you to think about those things. This presentation is going to be very much about what the early moderns knew about the body and about anatomy. I'm talking about the early modern period with you because we tend to find the beginnings of many things that we care about today in the early modern period. If we think of ourselves as modern, which arguably we do, then the early modern period is where these institutions started to come about. And so the kind of philosophy that gave way to democracy began in the early modern period. The kind of religious traditions that gave way to most current religious traditions in our country anyway began in the early modern period. You can trace the sonnet to the early modern period. You can trace certain types of art that we still enjoy to that period. The beginning of women's rights began in the early modern period. And so we trace a lot of things there. So disability is no different, or the study of disability. But the study of disability begins in the body. And so this is what we're going to talk about. The first text that I want to talk about with you is Dejumani Corporis Fabrica, The Fabric of the Human Body, by Andreas Veselius. Some background. Medical practitioners in late medieval and early modern Europe were increasingly determined to see for themselves the hidden spaces of the body, focusing more on the importance of knowledge gained through witnessing and performing actual anatomical dissections, and relying less heavily on classical texts. So Vesalius's work, The Fabric, is not the first work of anatomy. However, Vesalius was writing this book of anatomy through having done anatomical dissections himself. So that's part of what's different. Classical ideas of the mind and body still held sway in the popular imagination in the early modern period, as well as in the early modern practice of medicine. But as the anatomical projects of Aristotle and Galen were revived in the 16th century, the practice of dissection developed swiftly. The 1543 publication of Vesalius Dejumani Corporis Fabrica marks a radical change in the practice of dissection. While his 14th and 15th century predecessors maintained a distance from their work, they would stand at a high podium, read aloud from an anatomical text while somebody else cut and handled the body. and somebody else used a wand to indicate the parts of the body to which the professor referred. Vesalius took a different approach, and you can see that approach in this frontispiece engraving from his work, which is on the screen now. This is a zoomed in portion of that frontispiece. And the man that you can see in sort of maroonish purple sleeves with a black goatee and black hair and his hands on the cadaver is Vesalius. Okay, so I'm gonna tell you some more about this. Vesalius did not confine himself to an elevated seat overlooking the corpse. Instead, he began a trend in which the anatomist was the central live performer in the spectacle of dissection, taking on the roles of demonstrator and ostensor, the person who points at things, himself. And you can see him pointing at a piece of the body here, and improvising and memorizing his lectures rather than reading them from a book. Unlike previous scholars who used dissection to illustrate the authority of a medical text, in other words, Vesalius's style made the body on the table the source of knowledge, and the anatomist the interpreter of that body and its knowledge. So rather than putting all of his faith, I guess, in a book about the body, Vesalius said, no, let's look at the body and write our books based on that, instead of looking to the book and looking for examples in the body. I'm going to go back to this frontispiece for just a second and just point out to you that this room in which this performance of the anatomy takes place looks very much like an early modern theater. And indeed, the anatomy room is called an anatomy theater, and it's still that way in medical schools today. You go to the anatomy theater. You can see that there are people in raised seats or risers above Vesalius looking down at the body. And everyone is paying attention to the body and what Vesalius is saying. And you can see some students taking notes in the back there. Vesalius published a student edition of his work, and his work radically changed the process of dissection, as you can see on the slide. He's considered the father of modern anatomy, and these are just some images from his text. I'm going to keep talking over them. Despite Vesalius's improvisational style in the anatomy theater, the book, De Fabrica, is carefully stitched, if you'll allow that pun. The text organizes the body by tables, charts, and taxonomies. And it is accompanied by just beautiful, incredibly detailed engravings. I got the chance to see not a color copy, alas, but a black and white copy of this text in person last year when I went to Washington, D.C. and the Folger Shakespeare Library. And even the black and white engravings just took my breath away. They are so much more detailed than what you can see in this slideshow. And I encourage you to go to the website that I've linked with the color Vesalius De Fabrica, which is where these images are from, and to look at those more closely on a larger screen. It's really worth looking at. These engravings are so important because anatomy is a science of seeing. This is a quote from Jonathan Sade. Anatomy was a science of seeing, and thus knowing and controlling the body in order to harness its appetites and desires. Few had direct access to these dissections, and so the public dissemination of anatomy texts made the previously exclusive scientific procedures and discourses of the theater available to a wide audience. These stunning drawings, etchings, and engravings aestheticized the human body as well. They made it beautiful. I keep going forward and back, but I want to go back to this muscle man here to show you, like, again, these are gorgeous engravings. Paré, who I keep going to, and now I'll actually go to him, also has some beautiful illustrations in his work, and so we're gonna look at a bit of that together. Um, this is the frontispiece of Paré's works. Okay, this is all of his collected works. This was first published in 1573 and revised and included in his works in 1585. Paré was a surgeon, so not just an anatomist, but a surgeon, and he's sort of the father of modern prosthetics and obstetrics. I'm a fan of his. He also reintroduced arterial ligature. It hadn't been done since the classical period, and he introduced that back into medicine. The work was translated and published in England in 1634 by Thomas Johnson, and this is the frontispiece that we are going to spend some time with in this lecture. So you can see at the top, the oval in the center is supposed to be a portrait of Paré himself. On the left of your screen, you can see surgeons interacting with their patients. The man that is standing in the upper left-hand corner and sort of bending over the body with something in his hands, that something is a drill. It's a hand drill, and he's drilling into the skull of that person who is lying prone on the table. I'm not really sure quite what the seated patient is having done, but that person is messing with his head as well. And on the right, you can see a person preparing medication, or perhaps preparing a page of parchment to write upon. In the middle of the frontispiece, you have illustrations that might remind you of Vesalius. On the side, you have on the left side, you have the full skeleton of the human body, and on the right side, you have that skeleton in the same position, wrapped now though in muscle. And so the skeletons and the muscle men in these books, again, aestheticized the human body. They made it, as they took it apart, they also put it into positions that would be seen as beautiful. At the bottom here are, on the left, it's a sort of a laboratory. In the middle, these are surgeons' tools. And on the right, you'll see the monsters and marvels that we'll begin to discuss in just a moment. In the center of that right-hand panel, you can see a three-headed goat. Next to that, you can see possibly a centaur or some other creature. These are mixed up sort of beings. This new image of the interior of the human left a really big mark on the early modern period. And writers often picked this up, this language of the body. So Paré in De Monstres is talking about three different types of bodies for the most part. He's talking about monsters, marvels, and maimed persons. Okay, so there's a reading from Paré's work on D2L, and this is where those quotes come from. Okay, so monsters, according to Paré, are things that appear outside of the course of nature. So Vesalius has spent all of this time illustrating like the human body, right? And what is normal about it. Paré is taking some time to point out things that could happen that seem abnormal, right? Or outside of the course of nature. So he says these are usually signs of some forthcoming misfortune, such as a child who is born with one arm, another who will have two heads, and additional members above or over the ordinary. Marvels, as opposed to monsters, are things that happen that are completely against nature, as when a woman will give birth to a serpent or to a dog or some other thing, and he will give some examples. Maimed persons are a separate category. And Paré takes time to say, I'm not really talking about those people here. I'm not talking about maimed persons, which is we would probably, like, he would probably, if he had our modern category of disability, say these were disabled folks, right? As opposed to monsters. So, maimed persons include the blind, the one eyed, the humpbacked, those who limp, or those having 6 digits on the hand or the feet, or else having less than five, that's syndactyly, or fused together, or arms too short, or the nose too sunken, as do the very flat nosed. And you might think back to Beast Claveret's wife there. Or those having spots or warts or whatever. Okay, and he says again, this is against nature, but it's not the same as monstrous. Here are some examples of monsters in Paré's work. You can see here that this is a drawing of what has been called in the past conjoined twins. This is, as the figure title there will tell you, the shape of a monster found in an egg. And you can see this monster has snakes for hair, like Medusa, coming out of the top of the head and also in the goatee area. Now I'm going to talk with you about another book. This is Helkia Crooke's Microcosmographia. Helkia Crooke's work is another one. It's just another in this line, right? And of anatomies that are really popular in the early modern period, and again, give this glimpse of the interior of the body and work to aestheticize the body and to set up what is quote unquote normal, right? Imagine my scare quotes happening versus what is abnormal or monstrous. So Helkia Crooke published this work in 1615. He put out a second edition in 1631. He's making some commentary, and Crooke is a pretty famous and important person as far as like the history of disability goes. Helkia Crooke was the physician to King James I of England. James I was successor to Elizabeth I. And he was also the keeper of Bedlam. Bedlam is, or was, a hospital for the insane. It was an insane asylum in early modern England. And it was terrible. It was kind of a snake pit. And Crooke was removed from that post actually because he took such poor care of patients, even by the standards of Bedlam. And so that tells you kind of a lot about Crooke. But many anatomists, including Helkia Crooke, believed that their work with the human body revealed information not just about humans, but about God and creation. And so Helkia Crooke wrote, "Whosoever doth well know himself, knoweth all things. First he shall know God, because he is fashioned and framed according to his image, by reason whereof he is called among the divines, the royal and imperial temple of God." So the early modern anatomists were taking very literally that verse about your body being a temple, right? That maxim about your body being a temple. They're looking to understand not just the human form, but where people belong in the cosmos, right? It's not just about people. This is a microcosm, right? The human body is a microcosm for creation itself. Now, we're going to move out of anatomies for a moment and into a different kind of work. This book that I'm about to talk with you about is called Essays, and it's by Michel de Montaigne. Montaigne is not an anatomist, but he's incredibly influenced by early modern anatomies. This focus on seeing the body as a place of knowledge, right? And on seeing itself as a method of knowledge production, makes anatomies incredibly pedagogical in nature. That is, all of these texts that I've shown you so far are meant to be teaching texts. But literature is also fairly pedagogical. And while Montaigne's work is called essays, right, which comes from the French verb essayer, meaning to try or to assail, there were many works in the early modern period that used the word anatomy in their titles, such as The Anatomy of the Christian Man, The Anatomy of Melancholy, The Anatomy of the English Nunnery at Lisbon, Dissected and Laid Open, An Anatomy of Independency, and also God's Anatomy upon Man's Heart. These anatomy texts might sound a little familiar to you. One of the first texts you read this semester had a title that worked like this. We read J. Dolmage's Anatomy and Archive of Disability Myths. And so one of the questions I asked you at the beginning of the term was why Dolmage chose anatomy as part of his title. It's because he's trying to teach you something, and that knowledge is based in the body. Montaigne isn't writing an anatomy, but he's still basing this new and experimental kind of writing, Montaigne invented the essay, in the body. He calls these works grotesques and monstrous bodies, pieced together of diverse members without definite shape, having no order, sequence, or proportion other than accidental. He says all of this by way of apology for the work. Like, this is a new thing I'm trying. These are essays I'm trying, right? But to call these grotesque and monstrous bodies, I think is really interesting and of a piece with the kind of work that Paré is doing. So one of the works by Montaigne we're looking at is an essay called Of a Monstrous Child. And this is text from that. 2 days ago, I saw a child that 2 men and a nurse who said they were the father, the uncle, and the aunt of it carried about to get money by showing it by reason it was so strange a creature. He says it was a common form. It went about and gabbled like other kids, but under the breast it was joined to another child without a head. So the kind of body that Montaigne is describing is that of a joined twin, right? The lesser child here, the second or the lesser twin, did not fully form. So Montaigne says this double body might be interpreted as a favorable prognostic to the King of France at that time, Henry III, of maintaining the parts of the state under the union of his laws. And so the one head governing the double body might bode well for France, right? But on the other hand, he says we should not make this like divination, right? We should not make these predictions because it might prove otherwise. It might not be true. Then he goes on to say, those we call monsters are not so to God, who sees in them the immensity of his work, the infinite forms that he has comprehended therein. And so Montaigne says, we might think that these bodies are monstrous, but God doesn't think so. So he goes on to say, whatever falls out contrary to custom, we say is contrary to nature, but actually nothing is contrary to nature. And so while he is calling this child monstrous, he's also acknowledging the fact that there's a lot of room in creation for difference. And what we might say is abnormal or contrary to nature doesn't necessarily mean that it's outside of the realm of possibility or nature. In some ways, what Montaigne is doing here is questioning the category of normalcy or natural. All of this is culminating for us in this idea of that monstrosity is tied to morals. Okay. Dolmetsch talks about this as one of his disability myths. Like the person's outside matches their inside, right? You can tell somebody's evil based on how they look. Okay. I want to take a second just to look at the words in English for monster and prodigy. Okay. So monster has a sort of complicated etymology. We can trace it to the Latin monstrare, meaning to show or to point out. And so you might recognize monstrare in the word demonstrate, right? To show, to point out. But we can also trace monster to the Latin monere, a verb meaning to warn or to advise, as in our word to admonish, right? And so monsters, etymologically, both show us something. We should notice them, right? And they should also warn us about something or give us advice about a better way to do things. Um, so that's something that I want you to sort of keep a pin in for a moment. When we use the word prodigy, we often are talking about someone like a piano prodigy or violin prodigy, someone who shows talent for an instrument specifically or an art form at an early age. But prodigy comes from the Latin prodigum, an omen or a freak, a wonder or a marvel. And this is always in Latin with a negative connotation. Um, we don't mean to call like a child prodigy. Usually that is like a positive term for us, but the word has changed over time. It always meant something negative previously. And so, in thinking about monsters and prodigies in the early modern period, we are really thinking about negative stuff. Okay. Very rarely does something monstrous lead in the early modern period to a positive perspective. And so, in class together on Tuesday morning, we are going to have a look at some broadsides from early modern England. Broadsides, I'll talk more with you about, but I'll give you just a brief overview here. This is an image of the one on the right is a full broadside. It was printed in exactly that fashion. It's just small on the slide. And then the image on the left is only the top of a broadside, and you'll see the full image in D2L. It's linked. Broadsides are, I'm going to show you about early modern paper and how it works. And so a broadside is a full sheet of paper printed on one side, and they were often used to publish news or songs, and they were used as decoration in homes because of these woodcuts, and we'll talk about those woodcuts. But you can see that both of these are about monstrous children, and they have the word true in their titles, the true description of two monstrous children on the left, and the true form and shape of a monstrous child on the right. Here are two broadsides. One is called Nature's Wonder, and the other is called The Two Inseparable Brothers. And again, these are about joined twins. These are different. The one on the left is The False Lover Rewarded. The one on the right is Pride's Fall, or a warning for English women. And so in the one on the right, you can certainly see that this monstrosity that you can see in the woodcut is meant to be a warning, right? It's an admonition. It's telling you like bad stuff will happen if you let pride get in the way. I'm not talking more about these broadsides now because we'll talk a lot about them in class together, and you'll actually do some work with them on your own. So where am I going with all of this? Well, eventually I'm going to get to Richard III. We're picking up Richard III next week, and we will talk about the way that the body is represented in Richard III and what monstrosity means in Richard III, what disability means in Richard III. And so we need to bring all of this back to disability, right? The early modern conception of disability was very much aligned with morality. Disability could be seen as a sin or a punishment for a sin. Rather, uh, preternatural ability could also be seen as a warning about something. Um, at the same time, though, because of the rapidly changing landscape of the medical profession and because of the publication of these anatomies, right? Um, disabilities came, disability was a part of life, right? Many, many, many people had disabilities in the early modern period. Um, it was just a fact. Um, and it wasn't always like we are much more likely to think of like, oh, what medical thing is this part of, right? Disability was often thought of as less medical and more just part of God's plan. God would visit disability upon people or cure them as he saw fit, and it didn't really have a lot to do with medicine. But these advances in anatomy and medicine changed the way that we think about disability. This emerging category of normalcy in the early modern period, um, at on the one hand, alleviated a lot of disability. Like it made certain conditions less likely because of the advent of modern medicine. On the other hand, it codified the body in such a way that any departure from that code of normalcy, anything outside of the norm, um, would indeed be seen as monstrous, and the category of disability comes into being in the late 17th century. And this that I've been talking about is all 16th century work. So I'm going to leave it there and we'll pick up uh, together in class with the broad science and then next week with Richard III.